potassium cyanide, would cause death in 10-15 seconds. After a pilot almost accidentally ingested an L-pill instead of candy during a December 1956 flight, the suicide pills were put into boxes to avoid confusion. When in 1960 the CIA realized that a pill breaking inside the cockpit would kill the pilot, it destroyed the L-pills, and as a replacement, its Technical Services Division developed a needle poisoned with a powerful shellfish toxin and hidden in a silver dollar. Only one was made because the agency decided if any pilot needed to use it the program would probably be cancelled. Like the suicide pill, not all pilots carried the coin, and Knudsen did not know of any that intended to commit suicide. He carried it as an escape tool. To decrease the risk of developing decompression sickness, pilots breathe 100% oxygen for an hour prior to taking off to remove nitrogen from the blood. A portable oxygen supply is used during transport to the aircraft. Since 2001, more than a dozen pilots have reportedly suffered the effects of decompression sickness, including permanent brain damage in 9 cases. Initial symptoms include disorientation and becoming unable to read. Factors increasing the risk of illness since 2001 include longer mission durations and more cockpit activity. Conventional reconnaissance missions would limit pilot duties to maintaining flight paths for camera photography. Operations over Afghanistan included more real-time activities, such as communication with ground troops, increasing their body's oxygen requirements and the risk of nitrogen bubble formation. U-2 pilots now exercise during oxygen pre-breathing. In 2012, modifications were initiated under the Cockpit Altitude Reduction Effort, CARE, increasing the cabin pressure from 3.88 psi to 7.65 psi, a 15,000 foot, 4,600 m, altitude equivalent. The urine collection device also was rebuilt to eliminate leakage. Sensors, edit. Existing cameras had ground resolution down to 23 feet, 7 m, from an altitude of 33,000 feet, 10,000 m, and were inadequate for the 70,000 feet, 21,000 m, altitude. Ground resolution of 9.8 feet, 3 m, was required, at a maximum payload weight of 440 pounds, 200 kilograms. The U-2's camera was specially designed by James G. Baker of Harvard and Richard Scott Perkin of the Perkin-Elmer Company, initially in collaboration and later separately. Initial missions were flown with the Trimetrogoner camera, consisting of 3 24-inch focal length, 610 mm, cameras, with f/8 resolving 60 lines per millimeter, and the ground resolution can be inferred by calculation to be 24 inches, 60 centimeters. This was followed by the B camera with a 36-inch focal length, 910 mm, lens with f/10 and image motion compensation, resolving 100 lines per millimeter, and the ground resolution can be inferred by calculation to be 9.1 inches, 23 centimeters. It was a panoramic camera which took pictures of an extremely large area of the Earth's surface. The lens design consisted of a single aspheric singlet lens. 6,000 foot, 1,800 m, reels of film were used, with the emulsion being coated on a polyester, PET, base that offered significantly improved dimensional stability over extremes of temperature and humidity compared to conventional cellulose acetate. In addition, the U-2 also carried a low-resolution Perkin-Elmer tracking camera using a 3-inch lens, which made continuous horizon-to-horizon photographs. This is common practice in high-resolution cameras in later systems also, where the large image helps localize the small high-resolution images. The aircraft carries a variety of sensors in the nose, cube, behind the cockpit, also known as the camera bay, and wing pods. The U-2 is capable of simultaneously collecting signals, imagery intelligence and air samples. Imagery intelligence sensors include either wet film photography, electro-optic, or radar imagery, the latter from the Raytheon ASARS-2 system. It can use both line-of-sight and over-horizon data links. Operational history, edit. United States, edit. Pilot selection and training, edit. Though the USAF and the Navy would eventually fly the U-2, the CIA had majority control over the project, codenamed Project Dragon Lady. Despite SAC Chief LeMay's early dismissal of the CL-282, the USAF in 1955 sought to take over the project and put it under SAC until Eisenhower repeated his opposition to military personnel flying the aircraft. Nonetheless, the USAF substantially participated in the project. Bissell described it as a 49% partner. The USAF agreed to select and train pilots and plot missions, while the CIA would handle cameras and project security, process film, and arrange foreign bases. Beyond not using American military personnel to fly the U-2, Eisenhower preferred to use non-U.S. citizens. 7 Greek pilots and a Polish expatriate were added to the U-2 trainees, although only 2 of the Greek pilots were subsequently allowed to fly the aircraft. Their flight proficiency was poor. The language barrier and a lack of appropriate flying experience proved problematic. By late 1955, foreign pilots had been dropped from the program. USAF pilots had to resign their military commissions before joining the agency as civilians, a process referred to as sheep dipping, and were always called drivers, not pilots. The program only recruited fighter pilots with reserve USAF commissions, as regular commissions complicated the resignation process. The program offered high salaries, and the USAF promised that pilots could return at the same rank as their peers. The CIA's standards for selection were higher than the USAF's once the latter began its own U-2 flights. Although more candidates were rejected, the CIA's program had a much lower accident rate. Test pilot Tony Levi trained other Lockheed pilots to fly the U-2. By September 1955 he had trained 6 USAF pilots, who in turn trained other sheep-dipped pilots. As no 2-seat trainer model was available for the program's first 15 years, training was done before the trainees' first solo flight and via radio. Pilots had to adjust to the U-2's unusual combination of jet engines and enormous, high-lift glider wings. Because of the coffin corner, they learned of the need to pay complete attention to flying when not using the autopilot. Test flights, edit. After Aquatone was funded and security handled by the CIA, the agency referred to all its high-altitude aircraft as articles. This was intended to reduce the chances of a security breach as part of a compartmented security system. These 3-digit article numbers were factory assigned. Article 341 was the original U-2 prototype, and it never received a USAF serial. The first flight took place at Groom Lake on the 1st of August, 1955, during what was intended to be only a high-speed taxi test. The sailplane-like wings were so efficient that the aircraft jumped into the air at 70 knots. 81 miles per hour, 130 kilometers per hour, amazing Levi, who, as he later said, had no intentions whatsoever of flying. The lakebed had no markings, making it difficult for Levi to judge the distance to the ground, and the brakes proved too weak. He bounced the U-2 once before it stopped rolling, but the aircraft suffered only minor damage. Levi again found landing the U-2 difficult during the first intentional test flight 3 days later. On his 6th try, He found that landing the aircraft by touching down on the rear wheel first was better than making the initial touchdown with the front wheel. Pilots continued to have difficulty during landing because the ground effect held the aircraft off the runway for long distances. On a test flight on the 8th of August, the U-2 reached 32,000 feet, 9,800 m, proving that Johnson had met his promised specifications and deadline. By the 16th of August, the prototype flew at 52,000 feet, 15,800 m, an altitude never before reached in sustained flight. By the 8th of September, it reached 65,000 feet, 19,800 m. By January 1956, the U-2 had so impressed the USAF that it decided to obtain its own aircraft. The USAF purchased a total of 31 U-2s through the CIA. The transaction's code name, Project Dragon Lady, was the origin of the aircraft's nickname. Meanwhile, U-2s conducted 8 overflights of the U.S. in April 1956, convincing project overseers that the aircraft was ready for deployment. As often happens with new aircraft designs, there were several operational accidents. One occurred during these test flights when a U-2 suffered a flameout over Tennessee. The pilot calculated that he could reach New Mexico. Every airbase in the continental U.S. had sealed orders to carry out if a U-2 landed. The commander of Kirtland Air Force Base near Albuquerque, New Mexico, was told to open his orders, prepare for the arrival of an unusual aircraft making a dead stick landing, and get it inside a hangar as soon as possible. The U-2 successfully landed after gliding for more than 300 miles, 480 kilometers, and its strange, glider-like appearance and the space-suited pilot startled the base commander and other witnesses. Not all U-2 incidents were so benign, with 3 fatal accidents in 1956 alone. The first was on the 15th of May, 1956, when the pilot stalled the aircraft during a post-takeoff maneuver that was intended to drop off the wingtip outrigger wheels. The second occurred on the 31st of August, when the pilot stalled the aircraft immediately after takeoff. On the 17th of September, a third aircraft disintegrated during ascent in Germany, also killing the pilot. There were other non-fatal incidents, including at least one that resulted in the loss of the aircraft. Cover story, edit. A committee of Army, Navy, USAF, CIA, NSA, and State Department representatives created lists of priority targets for U-2 and other intelligence gathering methods. The U-2 project received the list and drew up flight plans, and the committee provided a detailed rationale for each plan for the President to consider as he decided whether to approve it. The CIA's Photo Intelligence Division grew in size to prepare for the expected flood of U-2 photographs. Before the aircraft became operational, however, USAF's Project Genitrix, which used high-altitude balloons to photograph the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe, led to many diplomatic protests from those countries, and for a while, CIA officials feared that the U-2 project was at risk. While Genitrix was also a technical failure, only 34 of the 516 balloons returned usable photographs. The balloon flights gave the United States many clues on how the communist countries used radar to track overflights, which benefited the U-2 program. With approval from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA's Director Hugh Dryden, Bissell's team at the CIA developed a cover story for the U-2 that described the aircraft as used by NACA for high-altitude weather research. The cover story would be used if the aircraft were lost over hostile territory. U-2s flew some real weather-related missions, taking photographs that appeared in the press, and sometimes had civilian government decals, but few believed in the cover story. In May 1957, the UK's Daily Express newspaper reported the U-2 operating east of the Iron Curtain. The civilian advisors Land and Killian disagreed with the cover story, advising that in case of an aircraft loss, the United States forthrightly acknowledge its use of U-2 overflights to guard against surprise attack. Their advice was not followed, and the weather cover story led to the disaster that followed the May 1960 U-2 loss. Initial overflights of Communist territory, edit. The British government in January 1956 approved the U-2's deployment from RAF Lakenheath. NACA announced that the USAF Air Weather Service would use a Lockheed-developed aircraft to study the weather and cosmic rays at altitudes up to 55,000 feet. Accordingly, the first CIA detachment of U-2s, Detachment O, was known publicly as the 1st Weather Reconnaissance Squadron, Provisional, WRSP-1. The death in April 1956, however, of British agent Lionel Crabb while examining Soviet ships in Portsmouth Harbour embarrassed the British government, which asked the United States to postpone the Lakenheath flights. To avoid delays, in June 1956, Detachment A moved to Wiesbaden, Germany, without approval from the German government, while Giebelstadt Army Airfield was prepared as a more permanent base. Eisenhower remained concerned that despite their great intelligence value, overflights of the Soviet Union might cause a war. While the U-2 was under development, at the 1955 Geneva summit he proposed to Nikita Khrushchev that the Soviet Union and the United States would each grant the other country airfields to use to photograph military installations. Khrushchev rejected the open skies proposal. The CIA told the president that the Soviets could not track high-altitude U-2 flights. This belief was based on studies using old Soviet radar systems and American systems that were not as effective at high altitudes as current Soviet systems, of which the US was not aware. Knudsen later said that the U-2 was really quite invisible to American radar, but Russian radar were a little different, better, you might say. Although the Office of Scientific Intelligence issued a more cautious report in May 1956 that stated that detection was possible, it believed that the Soviets could not consistently track the aircraft. Dulles further told Eisenhower, according to presidential aide Andrew Goodpaster, that in any aircraft loss the pilot would almost certainly not survive. With such assurances and the growing demand for accurate intelligence regarding the alleged bomber gap between the US and the Soviet Union, in June 1956 Eisenhower approved 10 days of overflights. The first U-2 overflight had already occurred, using the existing authorization of Air Force overflights over Eastern Europe. On the 20th of June 1956, a U-2 flew over Poland and East Germany, with more flights on the 2nd of July. When Eisenhower refused to approve the U-2's flight over Soviet airspace, the CIA turned to a foreign power, MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service, to request authorization from Prime Minister of the United Kingdom Harold Macmillan, who approved the flights. The fact that radar had, contrary to the CIA's expectations, successfully tracked the aircraft worried Eisenhower, but he approved the first Soviet overflight, Mission 2013 on the 4th of July. U-2 Article 347's main targets were the Soviet submarine construction program in Leningrad, and counting the numbers of the new Myasishka M4 Bison bomber. Soviet radar monitored the U-2 incursion into Soviet airspace in real time, with radar tracking starting from the time the aircraft crossed into East German airspace. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was informed immediately. While contemplating appropriate retaliatory steps, he ordered Soviet ambassador to Washington, Georgy Zarubin, to protest vehemently to the U.S. State Department that very day, explaining that the recent trust building to ease tensions between the two countries was undermined by the overflight provocations. A second flight on the 5th of July continued searching for bisons, took photographs of Moscow, the only ones taken by the program, and flew over cloud-covered rocket factories at Kaliningrad and Khimki. Eisenhower knew from the earlier overflights that his hope of no Soviet detection was unrealistic, but ordered that the overflights stop if the aircraft could be tracked. The CIA found that the Soviets could not consistently track the U-2s and therefore did not know that Moscow and Leningrad had been overflown. The aircraft's photographs showed tiny images of MiG-15s and MiG-17s attempting and failing to intercept the aircraft, proving that the Soviets could not shoot down an operational U-2. Knudsen recalled that the constant stream of Russian fighters trying to shoot down the U-2 during overflights was sometimes so thick that they interfered with photographs. Repeatedly failing for years to stop the aircraft embarrassed the USSR, which made diplomatic protests against the flights but did not publicize the penetration of Soviet territory. U-2 missions from Wiesbaden would depart westward in order to gain altitude over friendly territory before turning eastward at operational altitudes. The NATO air defense mission in that area included No. 1 Air Division Acath, Europe, which operated the Canadair Sabre Mark 6 from bases in northeastern France. This aircraft had a service ceiling of 54,000 feet and numerous encounters between the U-2 and Acath Zulu alert flights have been recorded for posterity. Bomber Gap disproven, edit. Main article, Bomber Gap. On the 10th of July, the Soviets protested what they described as overflights by a USAF twin-engine medium bomber, apparently believing that it was a B-57 Canberra. The US replied on the 19th of July that no American military planes had overflown the Soviet Union, but the fact that the Soviets' reports showed that they could track the U-2s for extended periods caused Eisenhower to immediately halt overflights over Eastern Europe. Beyond the Soviet protests, the president was concerned about the American public's reaction to the news that the US had violated international law. To avoid project cancellation, the CIA began Project Rainbow to make the U-2 less detectable. The 8 overflights over communist territory, however, had already shown that the bomber gap did not exist. The U-2s had not found any M4 Bison bombers at the 9 bases they had visited. Because the Eisenhower administration could not disclose the source of its intelligence, however, congressional and public debate over the bomber gap continued. Suez Crisis and Aftermath, edit. The presidential order did not restrict U-2 flights outside Eastern Europe. In May 1956, Turkey approved the deployment of Detachment B at Incirlik Air Base, near Adana, Turkey. Before the new detachment was ready, however, Detachment A in late August used Adana as a refueling base to photograph the Mediterranean. The aircraft found evidence of many British troops on Malta and Cyprus as the United Kingdom prepared for its forthcoming intervention in Suez. The US released some of the photographs to the British government. As the crisis grew in seriousness, the project converted from a source of strategic reconnaissance, which prioritized high quality over speed. The film was processed by its maker, then analyzed in Washington, to a tactical reconnaissance unit that provided immediate analysis. The Photo Intelligence Division set up a lab at Wiesbaden, as Detachment B took over from A and flew over targets that remain classified as of July 2013. The Wiesbaden lab's rapid reports helped the US government to predict the Israeli-British-French attack on Egypt 3 days before it began on the 29th of October. On the 1st of November a flight flew over the Egyptian air base at Al Mazrah twice, 10 minutes apart, in between the British and French attacked the base, and the visible results of the attack in the 10-minute reconnaissance impressed Eisenhower. Beginning on the 5th of November, flights over Syria showed that the Soviets had not sent aircraft there despite their threats against the British, French and Israelis, a cause of worry for the US. In the 4 years following the Suez Crisis, repeated U-2 missions over the Middle East were launched, particularly in times of tension. The end of the 1958 Lebanon crisis saw a decline in U-2 operations, although Detachment B U-2s operating from Turkey still sometimes overflew the Middle East along with occasional missions over Albania to check for Soviet missile activity. Israel was a major target of U-2 missions during this period, with U-2 missions detecting the construction of the Negev Nuclear Research Center in 1958, first bringing Israel's nuclear program to the attention of the US. The overflights drew the attention of the Israeli Air Force. Its radars detected and tracked the overflights, and on numerous occasions, Israeli fighter aircraft were scrambled to intercept them but were unable to reach their altitude. The Israeli government was baffled by the overflights. However, Israeli fighter pilots were twice able to spot the intruding aircraft. On the 11th of March, 1959, 2 Israeli Super Mist fighters were directed to intercept a U-2 detected over Israel by Israeli ground-based radar. Although the aircraft were unable to make an intercept, the formation leader, Major Joseph Allen, managed to get a good look at the aircraft. He subsequently identified it out of a book as a U-2, registered as a weather reconnaissance aircraft to the U.S. Weather Service. On the 22nd of July, 1959, after an overflight was detected, an Israeli Air Force Vorta jet was deployed to photograph the mysterious aircraft. The Vorta came within visual range and the U-2 was successfully photographed. In spite of this, it was not until the 1960 shoot-down of a U-2 over the Soviet Union and its subsequent public exposure as a spy plane that the Israeli government understood the identity of the mystery aircraft. Renewal of Eastern Bloc overflights, edit. Eisenhower refused CIA pleas in September 1956 to reauthorize overflights of Eastern Europe but the Hungarian Revolution in November, and his re-election that month, caused the president to permit flights over border areas. Soviet interceptors could still not reach the U-2s but, after the Soviets protested a December overflight of Vladivostok by RB-57DS, Eisenhower again forbade communist overflights. Flights close to the border continued, now including the first Allied-equipped U-2s. In May 1957, Eisenhower again authorized overflights over certain important Soviet missile and atomic facilities. He continued to personally authorize each flight, closely examining maps and sometimes making changes to the flight plan. By 1957, one of the European units was based at Giebelstadt, and the Far Eastern unit was based at the Naval Air Facility at Suchai, Japan. Part of the reason for the May reauthorization was that the CIA promised that improvements from Project Rainbow would make the majority of U-2 flights undetected. On the 2nd of April, 1957, a Rainbow test flight crashed in Nevada, killing the pilot. The U-2's large wingspan slowed its descent during crashes, often leaving its remains salvageable. Lockheed was able to rebuild the wreckage from the incident into a flyable airframe, but that it could do so should have been evidence to the CIA that its cover story might not be viable after a crash in hostile territory. The Rainbow anti-radar modifications were not very successful, and their use ended in 1958. Soviet overflights resumed in June 1957 from Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska to the Russian Far East, which had less effective radar systems. Others originated from Lahore, Pakistan. A Lahore flight on the 5th of August provided the first photographs of the Baikonur Cosmodrome near Tehran. The CIA had been unaware of its existence until then. Other flights examined the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site and the Srishigan missile test site. After a few more overflights that year, only 5 more took place before the May 1960 incident because of Eisenhower's increasing caution. The president sought to avoid angering the Soviets as he worked to achieve a nuclear test ban. Meanwhile, the Soviets began trying to shoot down U-2 flights that never entered Soviet airspace, and the details in their diplomatic protests showed that Soviet radar operators were able to effectively track the aircraft. To reduce visibility, Lockheed painted the